UN and OSCE commitments, and even their own constitution. The ultra-nationalists and neo-Nazis who seized power in Kiev in a Western-backed coup have unleashed true terror. It is impossible to recall the terrible tragedy in Odessa on the 2nd of May 2014 without shuddering. At the time, peaceful protesters were burned alive in the trade union house. The perpetrators of this atrocity are known by name. They even posed for cameras, but so far they have not been punished. The mass graves discovered there are irrefutable evidence of the criminal consequences of the heavy shelling of civilian sites in Donbass. A forensic medical examination has established that the majority of the dead were women and elderly people. Our Western colleagues simply ignore the numerous cases of these blatant violations of fundamental rights, the right to life. Attempts to draw the attention of the Human Rights Council to these atrocities that have been carried out for 8 years have been met with indifference. The Ukrainian regime has pursued a course of aggressive de-Russification and forced assimilation throughout these years. People who consider themselves Russians and would like to preserve their identity, language and culture are told they are strangers in Ukraine. Zelensky called them specimens and advised them to move away to Russia. He initiated the adoption of a law on indigenous peoples, amongst whom there is no place for the Russians who have been living on these lands for centuries, and this is quite in the spirit of lawmaking in Nazi Germany. The Russian language is being banished from schools and universities, from the public sphere, from everyday life. Situations are not uncommon in which the right to speak your native language can cost you not only your job, your health, but also your life. Just imagine if Ireland banned English, Belgium banned French, and Italian banned German. It is simply impossible to imagine. The frontal attack against the Russian language in Ukraine is not repulsed by the enlightened West and is even encouraged by some. Any sign of dissent has the most serious consequences. The process of cleansing the government of undesirable and disloyal officials takes place on a regular basis. The main assistance provided here is from the law on lustration adopted by the Verkhovna Rada. Other legislative acts are produced which allow the regime's security agencies to crack down on dissent and persecute the opposition. The authorities impose bans on TV channels and mass media and carry out repressions against their own citizens, including members of parliament. Is this not a violation of the freedom of speech, the right to express one's opinion? Lies about the Second World War are being shamelessly propagated. The local henchmen of Hitler are being hailed as heroes, while the real anti-fascist heroes are consigned to oblivion. Monuments to the victors of fascism are demolished. War criminals who fought in the ranks of the Third Reich are glorified. The latest demonstration of this course was the submission by the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine to the Verkhovna Rada on the 23rd of February of this year of the draft law on the withdrawal of Ukraine from the agreement on the commemoration of the causes and heroism of peoples in the Great Patriotic War of 1941-1945. Against this background, the conduct of Zelensky, who had the conscience to declare on that selfsame day that he was honoring the memory of his grandfather who fought in the Red Army to liberate the Soviet Union and Europe from fascism, is the height of blasphemy. The Kiev regime has even introduced itself into the sensitive, intimate sphere of people's spiritual world. Discrimination on the basis of religion is intensifying. The former authorities, led by Poroshenko, with the support of Washington, implemented a church split, creating the so-called Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Laws against the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate have been initiated. Churches that belong to it are seized, millions of parishioners and clergy are persecuted. What is this but a violation of the freedom of religion? All these massive and systematic attacks on the rights and freedoms and the consistent dissemination of neo-Nazism are carried out with the open connivance of the United States, Canada and the European Union, which arrogantly declare themselves the standard bearers of democracy. The international human rights mechanisms of the United Nations, the Council of Europe and the OSCE have been unable throughout these years to find the courage to respond appropriately to the outrageous lawlessness in Ukraine, and they have also been under the pressure of the countries mentioned above. The West began to turn a blind eye to what was happening in February 2014, when radicals carried out an unconstitutional coup d'etat and tore up the agreement reached with the then Ukrainian president, backed by EU guarantees. Once in power, the coup plotters proclaimed an alliance with the West and immediately launched an attack on the Russian language, intending to expel anything that was Russian from Crimea and deploying armed militants there. The eastern regions of Ukraine that did not accept the coup were accused of terrorism, even though they did not attack anyone. On the contrary, punitive units were deployed against them and their cities were bombed with aircraft, artillery and multi-rocket launchers. They destroyed civilian buildings, schools and hospitals. Civilians were killed. An inhumane economic, transport and food blockade was imposed on the Donbass. The Kiev regime got away with all of this. International bodies were, at best, limited to sterile appeals to both sides. It is clear that under these conditions, the residents of Crimea and Donbass had no other choice. In March 2014, the overwhelming majority of Crimean residents expressed their views in full compliance with international law in favor for the incorporation of the peninsula into Russia. The implementation of the right of peoples to self-determination is enshrined in the UN Charter, and this allowed them to defend their right to life, to the free use of their mother tongue, their traditions, their history and culture. In response, Kiev blocked the North Crimean Canal, the main source of fresh water for the inhabitants of the peninsula, and once again everyone was silent, forgetting about the 5 international conventions that enshrine the human right to safe drinking water. As to the residents of Donbass, after the Minsk package of measures approved by the United Nations Security Council in February 2015, they hoped that they would be heard and that justice would prevail, that Kiev would engage in a dialogue with its citizens, the people of Donetsk and Luhansk, and begin to implement all the other obligations under the Minsk agreements, which, however, Kiev has directly sabotaged with the direct support of the West and has continued armed provocations. Recently, the Ukrainian regime's criminal actions have intensified dramatically. As a consequence, since mid-February alone, more than 100,000 refugees from Donbass have found refuge in Russia. We have collected a solid body of evidence of gross mass violations of human rights committed by the Kiev authorities. An online exhibition of documents and photographs exposing the atrocities committed by the Ukrainian military and neo-Nazi volunteer battalions has been launched on the website of the Russian Permanent Mission in Geneva. I urge all those who care about human rights to see this exhibition in order to discover the truth which the Kiev regime, its patrons, and unfortunately most of the Western media are studiously trying to conceal. In a context of a gross violation of the rights of Russian and Russian-speaking citizens of Ukraine, the 8-year war unleashed against them with all the characteristics of genocide, the persistent refusal of the West to call the Ukrainian authorities to order, and the absence of any reaction from the UN, the OSCE, and the Council of Europe human rights structures, Russia could not remain indifferent to the fate of the 4 million-strong Donbass. President Putin decided to recognize the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, and in response to an appeal by the leaders of the DPR and LPR, to launch a special military operation to protect these inhabitants in accordance with the Treaty on Friendship and Mutual Assistance concluded with these republics. The purpose of our action is to save these people by fulfilling our obligations as allies and to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine so that such a thing will never occur again. This is particularly relevant in the light of the fact that this country is being dragged into NATO, that the country is being flooded with offensive weapons, and this is a country which has openly made territorial claims against the Russian Federation and threatened to use force and to acquire military nuclear capability. Regarding the campaign launched against the alleged violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, whose initiators show complete indifference and contempt for human rights violations, I would like to draw your attention to the 1970 Declaration on Principles of International Law concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states in accordance with the UN Charter. This document, approved by a consensus resolution of the UN General Assembly, stipulates that the principle of respect for territorial integrity applies to, and I quote, states which respect in their actions the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and therefore have governments which represent, without distinction as to race, creed or color, the people who inhabit the territory. End quote. The Kievan neo-Nazi government clearly was not and is not a government of the peoples of Ukraine. The US and its allies, who are directly responsible for numerous violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, and crimes that has made victims of hundreds of thousands of ordinary people in Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya and Afghanistan, are once again demonstrating their double standards. The current regime in Kiev is a vivid example of the fact that when you are a loyal vassal of a hegemon and participate with particular zeal in serving his policy of containing Russia, everything is allowed to you. You can trample any human rights, freedoms, simply kill people, cultivate neo-Nazi traditions and routines, and in exchange for your unquestioning loyalty and obedience, the civilized West will turn a blind eye to all your actions. Moreover, the other day, in a Russophobic frenzy, the European Union decided to supply Kiev with lethal weapons. For us, the life of every Russian, Ukrainian, and every citizen of Donetsk and Luhansk is no less valuable than the life of a European or an American. As President Putin has repeatedly stressed, that we have an unwavering respect for the Ukrainian people, their language and traditions. We do not intend in any way to infringe on the interests of the citizens of Ukraine with whom we are united, not only by a common history, civilizational, spiritual and cultural affinities, but also simply by blood and family ties. Millions of Ukrainian natives live in Russia today. They are native for us. We regard them as ours. Together we have always been and will be many times stronger and more successful. The main thing is to stop the attempts of the temporary powers that have illegally seized power to betray the fundamental interests of the Ukrainian people and to pursue a policy of turning their country into an anti-Russia to please the West. The real hysteria observed in NATO and in the EU today confirms that it was and still is the aim of the US and its allies, built by Washington, to create an anti-Russia. As you know, at Zelensky's request, negotiations have begun between Russian representatives and the Kiev delegation. I hope that the Ukrainian party is aware of the seriousness of the situation and of its responsibility, and realizes the need to show its autonomy and its ability to negotiate and to avoid a repetition of history with the Minsk agreements. I would like to conclude by recalling that human rights are a universal constant. They cannot depend on the selfish ambitions of a select few who seek to rewrite the 1948 Universal Declaration, to twist it to their liking and replace it with their own rules. The consensus then achieved lies at the basis of all of our collective work. The role of the UN Human Rights Council is to ensure commitment to our common values and not to the narrow values of others, to promote a mutually respectful debate without any politicization or double standards, and to ensure that human rights issues are not used to interfere in internal affairs. This is the only way to seek justice in any issue that affects people's core interests and fundamental rights. Whether it is the shameful institution of statelessness in Europe, the growing movement for the revival of Nazism, or the West's obsession with unlawful unilateral sanctions, whose targeting of ordinary people can no longer be concealed. These unlawful restrictions are no longer limited to financial and economic bans. They also extend to cultural, sports, tourism, educational, and the informational areas, and in general, they extend to all human contacts. The West has clearly lost control of itself in its desire to vent its anger on Russia, and has gone to the extent of destroying all the institutions and rules it has created, including the inviolability of property. The arrogant, exclusive and permissive philosophy of the West must come to an end. The sovereign equality of states is a key principle of the UN Charter. It fully applies to the work of the Human Rights Council. Russia is always open to an equal, mutually respectful discussion on any issue and is ready to seek a fair balance of interests.
Spasiba. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Jeppe Kofod, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Denmark, who will address the Council. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, Excellencies, colleagues. We meet in a tragic time in history. We are all devastated by the Russian attack on the sovereign nation and people of Ukraine. In images which were broadcasted all over the world, we saw families separated and children seeking shelter in Kiev's subway system. We saw kindergartens destroyed by Russian ordinances and giant holes blown in the middle of residential buildings in the center of the capital of Ukraine. We are outraged.